I'm Benji Balmer and live in Mount Vernon, Ohio. We have a company, Yellowbird Food Shed, that is trying to change the world through sourcing food directly from the growers and producers. Um, we call this our food shed, the geographic region with which our food is grown and produced and distributed in. And like most things in the world, this system is not divorced from all the other systems of the world. And so when we improve in one area, it improves other areas, but it also opens our eyes to the challenges that we're facing in all other areas. So as we dive deeper into this book, we're going to record these conversations. We're kind of slated for 6. I don't care if it goes to 60, if that's what it would take to, get to where we wanted to be. Jessica Burton is leading us through this, and did a wonderful job in that first night. And we're going to start at chapter 3 tonight. Maybe we'll make it to chapter 4. And you can use the chat function over on the side there to type in something if you want to. You can use the little hand that will raise your hand so that you can participate that way. Or if the opportunity is appropriate, you can just speak up and say your thing that way. So with that being said, we are recording this, and we'll have this, within the next week. We'll probably cut the beginning and the end of it off because there's like dead time, and then we'll post it back up on Facebook, and then you guys can have the link to send out to anybody that might be interested. But thanks for coming tonight. I know that there's a million things you could do with your time, and it means a lot to be here with us. I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thanks, Benji. Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled that y'all are here, that y'all came back. Especially as the temperatures get warmer, it's going to be so tempting just to be outside. And I want to kind of put that at the forefront too, but I really appreciate you guys coming back and being here. And I walked away from our conversation last time really enlightened and encouraged and inspired by this group, because I think that we kind of hopped over the stranger mark and we're able to really host and set some nice dialogue. So I really appreciate that. And I look forward to hearing your stories and your thoughts on these next couple of chapters that we'll discuss. And I also wanted to acknowledge what's happening around us socially as we start to delve into our discussion this evening, and wanting to put it out there if anyone has any thoughts or wants to talk about it either before we get started or just kind of during as we're talking. I would love to hear that. Specifically, the things that have transpired over the last couple of weeks is the start of the Derek Chauvin trial and the death of George Floyd. Even if you've heard some snippets throughout any news outlets, you will hear some of the testimony of those that were involved, and it's pretty raw. And I do think it really is enlightening to hear what's happening, and appreciative to the judge who allowed the live streaming of it, because due to COVID, there have been a lot of restrictions of those who can't be in the courtroom. So it's good that with that, everyone can hear that. And also the recent voting legislation that's passed in Georgia, and the subsequent fallout from that, Major League Baseball pulling the All-Star game out of Atlanta, some backlash from some of the corporations that are headquartered in Atlanta. Delta was one, for example, that spoke out fervently for it. So just wanted to acknowledge those and what's happening. And I don't know if it's irony or not, but on page 69, which is the end of chapter 4, Dr. Livingston highlights and really talks about the George Floyd case and how that is applied to what he's writing in the book, and wanted to highlight one of the things that he wrote towards the end here, starting at the bottom of 69. The point is that the problem is much larger than a few bad apples. Putting Derek Chauvin and the officers present at the Floyd killing in jail will treat the symptoms, but not the disease. When white people feel secure enough and concerned enough to renounce a pit bull-like system that protects and privileges them, while maiming people of color, then we will have made tremendous progress. Until then, it is important to realize that the ugly images from the George Floyd video were merely a reflection of deeper structures that lie beneath the surface. Most people do not realize how their actions, voting behavior, assumption that the Black person must have done something, or inactions, silence, indifference, create and uphold a system that licenses white people to harm Black people with a high level of impunity. And so I wanted to kind of open with that, because as I was going through and preparing, it's like, I don't know if he was kind of speaking into the future or what have you, but that talks into the chapter of privilege, and we'll go into that. But I thought it was really an ironic kind of turn of events that we're here now at the trial, and knowing that this has already transpired, that it's here and acknowledged here. So I'm looking forward to talking about that today. And just like last time, this is an open discussion. I try to talk as little as possible because I want to hear the thoughts of everyone that's here. And I hope that you'll just feel free to dive right in. Both of the chapter 3, how does social disadvantage differ for Blacks and whites? And chapter 4, what are the structural origins of racism, is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Both of those chapters we'll discuss on the topics of privilege and social hierarchies that are social constructs that we've helped to shape and define that justify racism kind of throughout our communities. So we'll discuss that and go from there. And does anybody have anything they'd like to open up with, or should we just dive right in? I want it to be a safe space where we can talk. Yes. Oh, you're still on mute.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
There we go. Sorry. I had something I wanted to bring up from last week that was shocking and surprised me that it was shocking to me. It was something that Melissa actually said towards the end of our meeting last week, and it was about, race is a social construct. But what Melissa said was racism is a construct of white supremacy. And I don't know why that hit me in such a really powerful way, but it did. And I just thought, wait, what? Yeah, of course, right, Melissa? I've been thinking about that for a good while, and still the fact that it shocked me, surprised me is interesting, but it did. And I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. That's good. So starting in chapter 3, how does social disadvantages differ for Blacks and whites? Dr. Livingston breaks down racism in 2 foundational forms, which really helped me a lot. And he further discusses how white is associated with positive attributes and Black with negative attributes. He defines white supremacy as the notion that whiteness and white people are superior and desirable, especially when contrasted with Blackness and Black people. And he defines anti-Blackness, which these are the 2 foundations of racism, the notion that Blackness and Black people are inferior and undesirable, especially when contrasted with whiteness and white people. How have these shaped our thoughts and behaviors, not just in our society, but in our everyday lives, or how we've been kind of conditioned or taught to be? Does anybody have any kind of thoughts on that, or how that has kind of shaped your thoughts, maybe even unconsciously, that you've been taught that?
An interesting thing that in my growing up experience, I went to an extremely diverse high school. I didn't live in a diverse neighborhood, and it was diverse economically, as well as racially, and not just white, Black, but also Asian. We had people coming, I graduated in 81, so we had people coming over from Vietnam, and we had a large Native American population. And I remember having an argument with my father, who was born in 1932. And I argued to him that any of the kids in my school having the same opportunities that I had could do anything that I did. And he vehemently opposed that position and felt like, no, they couldn't because they were Black, or no, they couldn't because they were Native American, or whatever. And he know how I, living in his household, came out differently in my thinking, but I remember, like, I'm like, these people are my friends. Yes, they could. And if they had opportunities like I do, they could do anything that I do. And it was just, I mean, of course it's generational, the difference between, you know, his generation and mine, but, and he's exactly 30 years older than me. So, you know, there's that, but it was just, I mean, I still to this day, like, am dumbfounded by some of the things that, you know, he believed and things that, you know, some of my aunts and some of my aunts and
believed with what they what they, you know, the things they said to me was like, oh well, you know, I mean, and this is offensive and I'm sorry, and I'm not using any foul language, but they would tell me, oh well, you know, black people are better at basketball because they bounce better because they're black. And it's like, what in the world, people, are you talking about? And so there's just this crazy, I know I've read, you know, the theories about Caucasianness and all of, you know, and so these are all things that are made up, like Melissa said, from white supremacy. And it just astonished me to hear this coming out of my father's mouth. And he worked for school district. I mean, he worked with these people. I mean, I went to school. This was a long time ago, and there were African American teachers in my school. There were African American administrators, and he worked with these people. But then he still had all of these thoughts, and it was just like, what?
I find that when I think of racism now, I think of the systemic piece of it. I barely engage in the individual piece. And this is kind of this is fairly recent, like a year or two, because I feel like I finally, after a couple of decades of learning and reaching out for resources and whatever I've done, it took me all of that, and it took me figuring out how to find it out in order to really begin to understand what systemic racism is. And I have people saying, oh, but you've been doing this work for blah, 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 you know, and I'm like, yeah, but no. I was doing work. It was all prep work for me learning, and this is a whole different thing. And so I'm finding, as a white person, I can close my door. I mean, walk in my house, shut my door, stay in my house. I mean, I did. I stayed in my house the whole pandemic. I started ordering Yellowbird. Like, I did all that stuff that I could do. And a lot of it was white privilege based on white supremacy. And when I used to hear the term white supremacy, all I thought of were KKK, you know, Southern Poverty Law Center. I used all their teaching stuff since pretty much they've been in existence. I follow their stuff. And I've had this whole, like, it's all spun around for me. And I'm like, oh, wow. Even for someone who had learned a lot, and I had done that on my own because I sought it out. So what I knew was more than a lot of people I spent time with. And I don't even understand it. Like, I'm coming to this realization that unless you have expanded your life in some way to include people who are different, you can't even begin to understand what it is. I don't know. This has like been going on with me for the last few weeks. So it just, I guess the bottom line, the response to what you asked, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's everywhere, entrenched in everything. And it's so much a part of who we are as a nation. I use that it really takes a lot of work to try to tease it all out. And reading Caste was really super helpful for me. But yeah, I don't know. I'll be quiet now.
No, that's so good. And I appreciate that you bring up the privilege and separate it between like the institutional and the individual, which Dr. Livingston also defines for us, which is so great for the next point. And talking about our perceptions of privilege. And he defines institutional privilege as all the advantages of whiteness that are inherited through these baked in foundational forces, which you were speaking to, Mindy, and their impact on political, economic, legal, social structures and policies and practice. Institutional privilege determines where people belong in keeping them in their place. And individual privilege, advantages that individuals obtain for themselves, also known as achieved status, that individuals can and do achieve wealth, power, and position through their own merit and labor or through simple luck. And I came across this on social media this week. It was a tweet. And this helped me also as I was kind of preparing this and really kind of think too of what privilege is and how I've tried to explain it to people. And it's that privilege isn't the presence of perks or benefits. It's the absence of obstacles and barriers. And that's a lot harder to notice. If you have a hard time recognizing your privileges, focus on what you don't have to go through and let that fuel your empathy and action. So it's those things of how Mindy, you were saying, I can just, go to my house and just live my daily life. And even adjusting through the pandemic, I've had the opportunities to just do that with grace. And for people who don't have those opportunities, or for people of color, or even those that are more disadvantaged, I'm showing up in the world. It's like I have this barrier against me because I'm Black, and for some people that's enough for them to either discriminate or treat me differently. I talk differently than them. I'm from a different family. I'm from a different area. So it's all of those things that are imposed barriers that others or white people don't have to really think about. And that was something that kind of just resonated with me. And yes, I will share that tweet, Melissa. And it also brought to the next part of self-esteem versus social status on page 40 in the book. And this was like just a light bulb moment for me, and how it ties into privilege. And I will take a moment to kind of define that, what Dr. Livingston was saying, that research has shown that while white people's sense of their own social status or privilege in society was strongly correlated with their income, occupation, prestige, and educational attainment, this was not true for Black people. It wasn't that Blacks didn't value achievements, they did, and it increased their self-esteem, how they felt about themselves, how I feel about myself, having attained those things that seem just every day to white people. However, it did not increase their perceptions of their social status or sense of their rank, regard, or standing in society. And when I think of that, I think, yeah, it's when you get an education and you go to college or you attain a certain job or position, that is supposed to increase your social status, where for Black people, it's not that. It's increases my self-esteem, because you're fighting barriers of like, yeah, I am smart, I can show up, I can have a seat at the table, I can do all of these things that I see my white peers doing. But at the same time, you don't equate that with a social status, because unfortunately, as you were saying, Simone, earlier, but you're still Black, so there's that part to it too. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on if you've thought anything like that, or if you've experienced that, or what that means to you, or if you found that to be enlightening or something that you've thought about.
I'll say something here on that note. Here's where I'm at, and here's where I find myself in the midst of all this. What you just described, when you become aware of it as a white person, a white male specifically, there's a problem with our food system. I always equate things back to food because I understand it, but I know how to fix it. I know what to do to fight against it. And so that's what I've done. In this situation, I'm not an empathetic person. I'm not an empath. And so it takes a lot of work for me to feel what somebody would feel that isn't me. And as I've put myself in these shoes, the thing I keep coming back to is this: how are Black people not furious all the time? I mean, not like I'm coming to a level of anger, but that I just live with this low level or even high level of residual. It makes me furious, and I can go to my own house and close my own door, just like Mindy said. I can't even imagine functioning as a human with that, and I don't know where that leaves us, but and maybe you can comment on it and help me to understand, or maybe there isn't an understanding, and this is what people feel like.
I posted a James Baldwin quote: "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all of the time."
Oh,
so yes.
Mhm.
However, I think, of course, I can't speak for all Black people, but there becomes a point where you have to decide, what does it look like to survive in the midst of your rage? And some people, that rage manifests in rebellion, right? So when we see protests, when we can see peaceful protests, we can also see the damaging of property, we can see rebellions. And I think when we understand, when that rage gets to a point where there's no system, there's no institution that is there to actually to address it, then there's no place for that rage to go, right? So when people have these conversations of centering property over people, I'm not saying you should go downtown and like bust windows. I'm not saying that's the best way to go, but I'm saying I get it. I'm saying I get how you got there, right? Especially if you have been a part of organizations that's done it, that's attempted to go the right way. When you are like from so many people, George Floyd was like the first instance, but if you're just above 35, you at least remotely remember Rodney King, right? And so everybody didn't have cell phones at that point, but somehow somebody was able to record that. For decades, LA police had been torturing Black people, been killing Black people. But in this case, it was torture. What we also overlook, we tend to overlook torture. That happens often across the country. They don't die, people aren't dead, but they're tortured. And Rodney King was forever damaged from that point on, right? And so people were like, we've been advocating, we've had so many organizations to push for police reform and eliminating police brutality. And we're like, finally, it's been recorded. Finally, because there's no way for us to do that, right? As everyday people, organizations to make sure we convict these folks. And now we have proof. And none of those officers went to jail. The city erupted. And we say, look at these people, like just damaging property. Like, you need to do it the right way. And it's like, were you there prior to when they were and nobody responded? I mean, the same way with Columbus, it was back, like, I don't know if I might have said this before. I can't remember. And y'all can stop me if you like. You said this last time. But since back in the 90s, the DOJ, like federal, was looking at Columbus Police Department because of their disproportionate harm against minorities. This is the 90s. And that's just the first time the federal government, the federal DOJ was looking at Columbus. That means there had been decades time before the 90s in which Columbus Police Department was doing this work. And then we have George Floyd and this happens, and now the downtown erupts. And you're like, this isn't new. Folks been working on this for a while, right? And then people having experiences of protesting and then police spraying them, harming them. This is Columbus, right? And so I think one of the things that stood out to me in this book was also the power of constructing narratives and the power of who gets to define reality and how much that is how so much of white supremacy is grounded in who gets to be human. And human meaning you get the ability to a do-over, like you get to make a mistake. You get to have your incidences explained away in ways that non-white people don't have that luxury. And to Jessica's point, which is great, to understand privilege is to understand the things you don't think about, which is hard to think about the stuff you don't think about, right? It's like to know the stuff you don't know. Like, how do I get there? That means people have to point it out to you. But then you have to prepare yourself to have it pointed out and not get defensive. And so most people aren't in a mental space to be able to say, oh, you're operating from a place of privilege. That's your privilege speaking. And you're like, what? I worked hard. I grew up poor. I'm a family of immigrants. Yes, and the fact that your family was even able to immigrate here speaks to white privilege. The way we had quotas set up for decades upon decades. The fact that you've had access, but you didn't know that until you look at the system. Because somebody coming from Nigeria, like trying to get to Ellis Island, wasn't accessible. And so like this Chauvin trial, the way that his lawyer is trying to say, essentially, George Floyd killed himself. Saying that, oh, well, he's a drug addict. And so because he's a drug addict, then somehow his heart failed, not because a whole man was on his neck, but goes back to these narratives around Blackness and poverty and this inhumanity that gets to be a justification for death. Whereas, what's his name? Roger, the guy who killed in Atlanta, who murdered those women, of those people's Asian folks, the early narrative is he had a bad day. He has a sexual addiction, right? There's a way in which there's a certain way humanity gets couched in certain ways that you can explain away murder. And that's how, if we don't really understand the ways in which, like, how white supremacy shows up, we can't really disrupt it. Right? Like, to your point, Benji, like you're saying, you have to like kind of dig into, like, to trying to understand. It's like, you have to be open for folks to be like, that's what it looks like right there. For the police to say, oh, he was having a bad day. A bad day? Somebody doesn't have a sister anymore. Somebody doesn't have a mama anymore. A bad day? You know, or I talk about how folks talk about black on black crime, and I say we have entire TV shows about white on white crime, Snapped, like Unsolved Mysteries, but we don't call it that. We got entire TV shows about it. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't call Sandy Hook white on white crime. Like, we don't call like the murders of the country concert. Y'all remember what was that in Texas? We don't call that white on white. It happens all the time. But the control of narratives.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be quiet now.
No. That's so good, Melissa. And there's just so much goodness in that. And honestly, like, it's interesting because I thought about the kind of the mass shooting narrative, and how it just gets excused away, or legislation happens or comes and goes. Even the correlation between the crack epidemic versus now opioids, and how that narrative is treated, that opioid addiction, you get to go to rehab or have, like, overdose drugs available for you, versus with crack, people just went to jail. And so it's really interesting to hear that and to see that. And also, in Dr. Livingston, although he is candid, he does it very objectively, which I appreciate. Speaking to what we were just talking about, in the book, he posed a question to Mayor Ted, who we fondly have gotten to know over the last few chapters. And he says, would a white person voluntarily choose to live their entire life permanently and irreversibly as a Black person in American society? Not a chance, in writing in the book. And then he goes on to further describe the conversation he had with Mayor Ted, and how even Mayor Ted had to come to his own self-realizations, and conclusions, like, that just, it seemed in the book like hit him like a freight train, like, wow, this is what's really happening. And I appreciated his candidness, because I heard that growing up, that a white person wouldn't, be in a Black person's shoes for even one day, let alone their entire life. And I think that kind of speaks to this piece, that the reality that they and those who oppress know what's going on and know what they're doing, which is why they don't want to be in those shoes, because they know what that outcome would feel like. So I think it was just so spot on, Melissa, and I just thought it was so great that you brought that up. And moving to the hierarchy piece, like social hierarchies, and the structurals of racism and how it even kind of started. Dr. Livingston describes, he breaks it down into a theory, which I love that he does it with data and science, that even though the racism is its own social construct, he uses the theory of group-based social hierarchies and why they were established over time to maintain, whether it was class or at the end of the day, as social dominance. And he speaks a lot about social dominance theory and how it applies to many constructs, and including the racism construct. And as you were reading the chapters, I wanted to kind of get some of your thoughts on how, in your own place where you've experienced some of this personalized theory, one of the foundations and definitions he gives is legitimizing myths, which kind of speaks to what Melissa was speaking to earlier. And he defines that as widely held but often fictitious beliefs that explain why people occupy different positions of power within social hierarchy. So you create the narrative, right? You say that this is why it should be this way, because this person or people occupies this space for this reason. And how institutionally that turns into the social hierarchy construct, that the use of intimidation, violence, or oppressive legal policies or practices are used to legitimize those myths and create that social dominance. And I know that we've talked kind of just through the conversation today fluidly of where we've seen some examples of what that looks like. And something that comes up even as we were just having our previous discussions in creating narratives, why, in your thoughts, why do you think some people think that this doesn't exist at all? Like the things that Dr. Livingston has been saying and what we've been talking about, there are people out there who legitimately believe that this is not true and that it is not really this way. I don't know if in your circles or things that you've read of why people believe that or refuse to believe or choose to be ignorant. But I still have personally a hard time grappling, like, okay, you see this happening and what they're doing, like, why is that not translating to reality?
noticed it mostly with a particular friend that has a son-in-law who's a police officer, and of course he's white, and he works undercover. And you just, I mean, the things that come from her are, well, you just don't know how dangerous it is for him out there, and you don't know what he has to do every day. And it's true. I have no idea. I've never been an undercover police officer, but I also know how dangerous it is for Black people to exist on the street, especially in Columbus and other places. And there's, I don't know, one of my friends says they think they put it all on education. Oh, they're ignorant, they're uneducated, they don't know. And I don't think it's education. I think people are just stuck. And that thought process, and in my mind, it almost comes down to, well, I'm a good person, so I'm not a white supremacist, and my son-in-law is not a white supremacist. He's a good person, so it couldn't possibly be these things. And I don't understand it either. It's like, gives me like, my brain just goes around and around. And I don't know if Dr. Livingston explains it further in the book or any of that. Thanks, good, Mindy. I'm glad. But it just, I mean, to me, because I have like, thought and worried and, thought about it for years and years. And it's just like, I don't know how you even conversate with a person like that, because, they get defensive. They throw up, oh, you're just anti-police, or you're just anti this, or you don't know this part of the situation. So because you don't know this part of the situation, everything you do know is invalid. And that's an invalid argument. I mean, there's no logic to that. So sorry, I'm going to mute out because my dog is barking.
He explains it, but he doesn't give you an easy path. Just so you know, there is no easy path. But I do have to say that the book has helped me see where it's coming from. I mean, I'm completely frustrated, but he made me understand things in a way that I hadn't previously understood.
I think people are afraid of what it will cost them in anything, not just this, but to get your health in order, to get whatever it might be. Well, what's it going to cost me? Because if I have to give up something to get that, then I'm now threatened. And that, I think, keeps people in their narrative and in the way that they're going to view the world, because you're going to believe what you want to believe about how you want the world to function. And if you think the world is functioning fine for you, or it's not, but you at least have an enemy that you can point to and say, that's the thing that's keeping me down, or that's the thing that, whatever it is, you have a villain to rail against. And that is, I think, what we see happening, just with everything, with the political parties polarizing to sides, with religious institutions.